have just come out of having a massive rebellion as a result of a government that was extremely weak in the Articles of Confederation. And now a meeting has been called in Philadelphia, and it's 55 men originally from 12 states. Rhode Island chose not to attend this first meeting to revise the Articles of Confederation. But ultimately they were unable to do that because it had to be unanimous to revise the Articles of Confederation. So they just kind of scrapped the entire thing, and over the course of an entire summer remade our government into something totally new. And we talked about some of the men that were there and who they made up. It was a lot of lawyers and merchants, and some of them were slave owners, but they were wealthy guys who all believed in a republicanism or Republican idea of government, where elected representatives make decisions on behalf of the people who chose them. So our country is built on compromise. What does the word compromise mean? Yeah, you come to an agreement. Usually whenever a compromise has to be had, why is that?
There's an argument?
Yeah, there's disagreement. There's at least two different sides to an issue or an argument. And so compromise is when somebody gives up something to get something else. Like, okay, you want this, but I want something different, so let's kind of try to meet in the middle. Who likes to compromise? Anybody like to compromise? I don't. I like to get exactly what I want. And so compromise is not always the best way to go, but it's definitely much better than having violence. But as I told you, our country and our Constitution in particular is a whole bundle of compromises, okay? So one of the compromises has to do with how representation is going to happen, okay? So this particular compromise is called the Great Compromise. All right. Under the Articles of Confederation, how many houses were there in the legislature? One. It was unicameral. It had a one-house legislature. And each state, under the Articles of Confederation, had how much representation? One vote per state. Okay? Was that a great system? Not really. So some states really liked that. What kind of states do you think liked having that one vote per state? Smaller states. And one of the states who had a smaller population, believe it or not, was New Jersey. And New Jersey came up with a plan, and their plan was to have a unicameral legislature, one house, with the number of representatives from each state to be equal. So a very similar plan to the Articles of Confederation, because it gave their smaller states equal authority to every other state. Every other state was the same. All the states would be the same. And because of this, state governments would have a lot of power. But bigger states, like the state of Virginia, which was the largest state in population at that time, they wanted to see a bicameral legislature where the number of representatives in one of the houses would be based on population. So the more representatives a state would have, the greater the number of representatives they would have in that house. So the more say they would have, the more votes. So, after a bitter and prolonged debate, the Great Compromise is had, where two houses are created. One is called the House of Representatives. And the number of representatives each state has in that is based upon that state's population. So the bigger the state, the more representatives you have. It still exists today. What state has the most population today? California. So California has the highest number of representatives. How many representatives does the state of California have in the House of Representatives? 53. How many does West Virginia have? 3.
Yeah.
3. Okay? So they're a lot bigger than West Virginia, but it's all based on population in the House of Representatives. But we also said that this great compromise is going to have a bicameral legislature. It's going to have 2 houses. One is the House of Representatives, based on population. What's the other one? The Senate. How many senators does each state have? 2. Each state has 2 senators. Does it matter how big or small your state is? Nope. Every state has 2 senators. You guys know who West Virginia's senators are? Currently? Joe Manchin and Shelley Moore Capito. Those are our 2 senators currently. And they get reelected every 6 years. Okay?
What state has like the least like the thingy?
I think there's several only have 3. Yeah. Like Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota. Like several states only have 3. Okay, so big states, why do the big states feel like they need to have this authority, extra authority?
Because they got more people.
Yeah, so what would be the implications of that having more people? Obviously, just having more say because there's more people, but it has to do with something else. Money. They're having more people who are being taxed. And so they wanted to have, some say on tax bills and tax revenue. And so all tax bills have to start in the House of Representatives. They're not allowed to start in the Senate. Okay? How do we know what the population is?
The census?
Yeah. You guys know, you ever heard of the census? How frequently do we do that?
10 years.
Every 10 years? When's the next one?
2030.
2030. In years that end in 0, there is a census. And it's not because the government's trying to keep tabs on you and microchip you. It's because it's in the Constitution. That's why. Okay, it is originally created just for the sole purpose of determining apportionment, or how many representatives each state should have. That's the purpose of the census. Okay? All right, so questions on the Great Compromise.
What year was it?
What's that?
The Great Compromise?
It happened at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. All summer long. It's a pretty prolonged debate over this. Okay, so got that compromise. The another, I don't have a slide for it, but we can talk about it anyway. Another thing that is created at the Constitutional Convention is it became very apparent that the need for a strong, independent executive branch was needed. There was no executive branch under the Articles of Confederation government. But because of Daniel Shays' rebellion and the example that was set in Massachusetts, it became apparent that a president or military commander-in-chief that would have powers of appointment was necessary. And so another compromise was had to determine the process by which that person is to be elected. And the election of the president, and now the vice president of the United States, is unique to every other type of election. What is the process called by which we elect the president of the United States? It is unique to that office alone. It is called the Electoral College. You ever heard of it? There is no college. It's not like a university. There's no school. Okay? But it is the method. It's a method by which the president is indirectly elected. by the Electoral College rather than by direct means. Is it possible for more people in the United States to vote for candidate A and candidate A lose?
Yeah.
Yes, it happens all the time, actually. It's very frequent. So the reason for that is because of the Electoral College. Let me try to show you on the map. Okay, so here we have a map of all the states. Now, obviously, when the Constitution was created, none of these states existed yet, but these did. So, but we'll just kind of look at this briefly. All right, so if the way in which we elect the president and the vice president is through the Electoral College. So each state has an Electoral College number. And that number is like West Virginia. You guys know what West Virginia's Electoral College number is? 5. Okay? Because we have, the way you get the Electoral College number for all the states is you take the number of House of Representatives members West Virginia has, and how many senators?
2.
So you get 5, that's how many? So California would have 55, because they have 53 House of Representatives members and 2 senators.
That's not fair.
Well, that's kind of how it works. That's how the Electoral College works. Now, this is the part that a lot of people disagree with. If there are, I don't know the numbers, let's say there are 2 million people that vote in the state of West Virginia, and 1,000,001 person vote for candidate A, and candidate B gets less than 1 million, they get one less vote. Okay, how many Electoral College votes does the winning candidate get? Do they get 2.5 because do they split them? How many do they get? All 5. So even if you only win by 1 vote, you get all 5 of that state's votes. So that's why it's possible, like if you can have a close election in a big state, and even if you only win by 1 vote, you get all of that state's votes. It's not proportioned. It's not divvied out. It's not a ratio. It's winner take all. Does that make sense? So that's how it's possible to have more people in the United States vote for you and you lose. Okay? So that being said, today, if I'm running for president of the United States, where am I going to go? Am I going to go West Virginia?
California.
I'm going to go here. I'm going to go here.
How many does Texas have?
I'm going to go here. I'm going to go here. I'll go Pennsylvania, and I'll go here. You win those states, you probably win the election. Okay? Now, that's kind of a broad, tough to win all those states, but that's how the system works. Okay? So questions on the Electoral College?
How come Illinois has so many?
Chicago. And also the Mississippi River's got a lot of people live next to the river. Okay? Anybody else? Good questions on this? It's actually, the Electoral College has been the subject of, I'm not going to say heated debate, but some debate, as some people believe it should be changed. But in order to do that, a constitutional amendment would have to be created to change it, because this is in the Constitution. Yes?
Wasn't it just created because there was like a lack of education when they found this, like a lack of public education? And so they didn't want like the uneducated to have that much of a say.
It was definitely a federalist idea to keep the wealthy, elite people in power. I'm not going to say that's the only reason, but yeah, it was definitely had something to do with it, without a doubt. Without a doubt. Okay? Questions on the Electoral College? All right, so good, that's good. All right, another compromise established out of the Constitutional Convention is what to do with the sectional problem of slavery. All right? So if you are, so slavery becomes an issue not over the obvious fact of its atrocity and it's horrible to human existence and immoral, but it becomes an issue as to how slaves should be counted in the census. So if you are a Southern slaveholder, how do you think slaves should be counted in the census? That's right, as a full person, as a human, as a person that counts in the census, because the higher your number is in the census, the higher your representation is in Congress. Whereas people in the North say, what about how slaves should be counted in the census?
Like 3/5 of a person?
Well, they say 0, because they're property, not people, which is kind of ugly in itself. So a compromise is had, and it is called what, Jenna? You know the number?
3/5 of a person?
That's right, the 3/5 compromise. Slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person. It's kind of one of the original sins of our Constitution. What it is referred to largely by historians today. And it's really the only mention of slavery in the Constitution. This compromise, this clause, has since been removed as a result of the 13th Amendment, which gives former slaves full citizenship, along with the 14th Amendment. But that is what the founding fathers did in terms of how slaves would be counted for representation purposes. Okay. All right, so they got it made. They got all these compromises made. They got 7 articles put together. They kind of like it. They think it's okay. They did the best they could after a whole summer. And now all these delegates, they're not all happy because it's a whole bundle of compromises. Nobody really likes to compromise, okay? But now these men have to go back to their home states and convince the people that live there to either support this, or if they don't like it, to not support it, all right? And that's called ratification. They have to try to ratify it. Ratify simply means to approve. Just because these guys made it doesn't make it law immediately. The people have to approve it. That's what the Constitution's all about. What's the first 3 words of it?
We the people.
We the people. So now the people have to decide on it. And it's going to be determined by the people in each state. Pretty quickly, 2 sides emerge over whether or not the Constitution should be ratified or not. And those 2 sides have names. One's called the Federalists, and the other ones are called Anti-Federalists. All right, now, in the future, like after George Washington's presidency, which doesn't exist yet because the Constitution hasn't been ratified, there's a political party that emerges called the Federalists. It's not the same as these Federalists. There are 2 types of Federalists. It all depends upon what time period you're talking about. So in the time period of ratification, a Federalist is simply a person who wants the Constitution ratified. An Anti-Federalist is a person who's named by the Federalists. They didn't say, hey, we're the Anti-Federalists. They were named by the Federalists, who wants to see additional protections to the Constitution. Okay? Now, obviously, the goal here at the end of 1787, at the end of the Constitutional Convention, the Constitutional Convention went from May the 25th to September the 17th of 1787. And at the end of this, they all go to their own states. And the ultimate goal is for all the states to ratify it. What's that word called if everyone agrees? Unanimous. They want it to be unanimous. That's unlikely because, of course, Rhode Island is most likely going to vote to veto, as they weren't even there. So the delegates, they said that whenever 9 states ratified, then it would take effect. Once 9 states had registered their approval or ratified through their own specially elected conventions, each state could do it however they wanted, that then the Constitution would become the supreme law of the land in those states ratifying. Okay. But as I said, there were a couple of people, not a couple, but a couple groups that emerged. And we mentioned one was the Federalists. The Federalists. This would be people like Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison. Those are your 3 most prominent Federalists. 2 of them are from New York and 1 is from Virginia. So it's not necessarily a regional thing. Okay? And in an effort to get people to support ratification of the Constitution, they began a propaganda campaign by issuing a series of essays called the Federalist Papers. They wrote essays and published them in newspapers. And they didn't sign them by their own names. They used like Greek and Roman names. Publius is the most common one for the Federalist.
Wow, this is weird.
It's just a pen name. Publius was a Roman writer, and what are we trying to do in America? We're trying to make democracy, and that's what the Romans had initially, until Julius Caesar came along. All right. But there were also some anti-Federalists, people like Sam Adams and Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee. And they said, hey, you wealthy people with your big fancy highfalutin constitution, you are you're likely to tread on the sacred freedoms that we people hold dear. And they published some papers of their own. They don't have a cool name like Federalist Papers, but they also published propaganda against ratification of the Constitution because they thought it was going to create an extremely powerful government. And they called when they signed their names Brutus. Brutus. You guys know Brutus?
Caesar's best friend who stabbed him.
Yeah. Brutus is known for killing tyrants. And that's what they thought the anti-Federalists looked at the Federalists as tyrants. And so that's why they chose Brutus as their pen name. Pretty clever. Pretty clever. It's all propaganda. Okay? But these anti-Federalists, claiming that this was anti-democratic and that the sovereignty of the states would be trampled upon and submerged as individual freedoms would be jeopardized by the absence of something. And ultimately, what do the anti-Federalists really want? They want something added to the Constitution. Anybody know what those things they want added are called?
Like more protection or something?
They definitely are protections of your individual freedoms or civil liberties. What did they want added to the Constitution? It happened. It got added after the fact, but it gets added. What is any addition to the Constitution called, or any change?
Oh, they wanted the Bill of Rights.
That's right. They wanted this thing called the Bill of Rights, which are today the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Now, they didn't have in mind it was going to be exactly 10. They just said, hey, we got a list of stuff we want in there. You get this stuff in there, we'll think about ratifying it. But it's the larger states that are a little more fearful of the Constitution than the smaller states. Small states, man, as soon as they got it, they approved it immediately. You guys know what the first state was, or is, and forever will be?
Massachusetts?
No, that's a pretty good-sized state. It'd be a small state. Delaware. Delaware's the first state. Why are they the first state? They're the first state to do something. First state to ratify the Constitution. That's what makes them the first state. You guys remember them state quarters that got issued a few years ago? Delaware says the first state. Okay, so the first large state to act was Pennsylvania. But it was tougher in some of the other larger states like Massachusetts. And the absence of a Bill of Rights is what was the really big holdup. People wanted to have that, the Anti-Federalists really wanted to have that Bill of Rights added. Kind of gave them some assurance that people's rights would be safeguarded. And I've got a list of what some of them are up here. They're pretty important. These were initially not part of the Constitution. Your freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, right to bear arms, the right of accused people, like all those things that have to happen to you before you can be formally punished for a crime. All of that is found here in the Bill of Rights. It's a big deal, okay? But over time, more and more states began to fall in line until 9 states were had. But of the 13, some of the ones that were missing were Virginia, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island. Virginia, New York, those are huge states. Those are huge. It looks really bad because that's like a significant portion of the population of the United States that doesn't want anything to do with the United States. So it really wanted to get those states added in. And this is an actual political cartoon put into a newspaper around the time of the ratification of the Constitution. So you can see here now, it says the ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient to the establishment of the Constitution. That is from Article 7 of the Constitution. And once those 9 states have already approved, you kind of see Virginia, and it looks like it's kind of tilting upward. And you can't see it great. But this is actually like a hand. Whose hand do you think this is? Or it is intended to be? It is a large, domineering hand. Could it be the hand of God? What is this cartoon trying to tell us? That it is what? That America is destined to happen. It is ordained by God for America to exist and for all the states to ratify. And he was going to do Virginia first, and you can see the power of God putting forth on New York. Well, regardless of how it happens, it does happen. And New York and Virginia do eventually ratify after a great deal of debate and in some cases violence. The ratification of the Constitution was a violent thing. So people disagreeing over how the government should operate and being violent over it is not a new idea. Our country was born that way. Okay? So, but eventually the dissent ends, and the Constitution, after about 4 years of ratification process, adds the Bill of Rights in 1791. And the minority win. The minority had triumphed. They got the Bill of Rights added. Okay, now what? We just created a brand new government out of thin air. Now what? Yeah, we gotta put it into action. So one of the things that is created out of this is a brand new executive branch. Who are they going to pick to do that? Who's going to be the leader of this executive branch, the commander-in-chief, the president of the United States of America? He's the first one. George Washington. He's there somewhere. There he is, George Washington. And you got to think, George got a tough job. I mean, this is a horrible job. President of the United States has always been a pretty terrible job to have. But you got to think about from Georgia's perspective. We've had 12 pretty troubled years. The American people had risen up and overthrown the British. We had the Articles of Confederation, which was a horrible example of government. Our finances of our infant country were horrible. Our revenue declined. We had massive public debt, worthless paper money. What metallic money we had was scarce. And the eyes of a skeptical world are looking at this upstart United States of America and thinking, I give it a couple years until they're come begging back to the empire. Not good. It's not good. Things are looking bleak for our country. It was not a guarantee that we were going to make it. Still isn't. Still an experiment in democracy. So, when the Constitution was officially launched in 1789, the population of the United States was doubling about every 25 years. That's pretty much exponential growth, okay? So, the first census in 1790, which is when the first one was, recorded almost 4 million people in the United States. So by 1815, it would be like 8 million people, and so on and so on. And then when the Industrial Revolution hits, it's even higher. Not to mention the millions of immigrants that come swarming to the United States as a result of the problems in Europe. So 90% of America's population was still rural. What does the word rural mean?
Like farmland.
Farmers. Living out in the middle of like where we live. Rural. Despite the fact that we had some strong, flourishing cities. But 90% of our country was rural. Only of all the population, only 5% lived west of the Appalachian Mountains. Very few people had lived like where we are. And that was mainly concentrated in places like Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. All of which became states within 14 years of the Constitution being ratified. So, enter George Washington. George Washington was unanimously drafted as President of the United States by the Electoral College in 1789. The only president to ever be elected unanimously. Ever. There have been some ones that have come really close. But he's the only one to gain every Electoral College vote that there was to be had.
Who came really close?
There's been several that have lost only by a state or two. But he's the only one to be unanimous. Okay. His presence is very imposing. Right? Very balanced, high character individual who commanded his men with strength of character rather than through the art of politics. He understood politics. He's not an idiot, but he's also not a brilliant politician. He's a soldier, okay? When he takes his solemn oath of office in the capital of the United States, which was where?
Is it like Philly?
New York. He takes the first capital is New York. He takes it on Wall Street. If you've ever been to New York, on Wall Street, right in front of the stock exchange, there's a statue of George Washington. It's because that's where he takes the oath of office on April 30th, 1789. And now this is something that he is the president of a new country, and the powers of his office are not really very clearly defined. What is it? What can he do? What can he do? He doesn't really know. And so the things that he does sets a precedent for future presidents. Does everybody understand what I'm saying with the word precedent and presidents? All right, so one of the things he does is he establishes a group of advisors. What are the group of advisors to the president called? Cabinet. Very good. The Constitution doesn't require he does this, but it merely provides that the president may require written opinions from assistants. So he establishes some cabinet positions. If you are the person in charge of a cabinet, what is your title? Secretary. You are a secretary. So George Washington establishes 3 executive departments, and they all 3 still exist today. One is the State Department. What is the purpose of the State Department then and today? What do they do? Well, everywhere on planet Earth, what is a state? What is a state everywhere on planet Earth? A country. So what do you think the Secretary of State's job is? Foreign affairs. They deal with other countries. Who is our very first ever Secretary of State? TJ, Thomas Jefferson. Okay. Thomas Jefferson, you should know him. Writer, author of the Declaration of Independence. Future President of the United States. And first Secretary of State. Another cabinet position, which President Washington appoints and really establishes, is the executive department that oversees our finances. That's right, the Department of Treasury. Who's the very first Department of Treasury? The Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Brilliant financial mind. Brilliant. One of the smartest Americans at the time. Could never be president as he was not born in the United States. He was born in the West Indies. And according to the Constitution, you have to be a natural born citizen to be president of the United States. But they put him on the $10 bill because he's the first Secretary of Treasury. What's on the back of the $10 bill? Anybody ever looked at it? The Department of the Treasury. That's what's there. Okay? As he's the first Secretary of Treasury. And third cabinet, you could probably guess the department, but probably not the person. Yeah, well, what's the executive department that deals with military or fighting? President Washington called it the Department of War, the War Department. We don't call it that anymore. It's a little too. We've politically corrected it. We call it the Defense Department. And the very first ever Defense Secretary or the Secretary of War was Henry Knox. Henry Knox. He's one of President Washington's old war buddies. He was an artilleryman.
What did you say we call it today?
Department of Defense. Now, do we have more than just 3 departments now?
Yeah.
Oh, man. We have a bunch. A whole bunch. Department of Education, Department of Health and Human Resources, Department of Interior, Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security. We have all kinds of executive departments. And the whole purpose of them is to help the president to carry out the law. They're law enforcement agencies. All right? So, because that's what the president does. The president of the United States enforces laws. The president doesn't make them. The president enforces them. Okay? So, questions on these 3 cabinet positions. All right, so you got a pretty unique, interesting group of dudes in his cabinet. And these 2 guys, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, do not agree really on anything at all, ever. They have 2, it's not that they are, one's bad and one's good. They both want what's best for America. They just have very different ideas on how that is to happen. Thomas Jefferson likes the idea of stronger state governments. He doesn't want to see the federal government trample upon the rights of citizens. He believes that America should be an agrarian nation full of farmers, pastoral, peaceful farmers living out in the countryside with very little federal government interference. Whereas Alexander Hamilton sees America as a vast land of opportunity and natural resources which can be turned into manufacturing. In order to do that, we have to have capital available and banking, and people can get loans and build houses and then build factories and put people to work. Both are great, and both people have, there's room for that. Both of those types of people in America, but they're not willing to see it the other person's way. And stuck in the middle of all this is George Washington, because he literally has 3 advisors: Jefferson, Hamilton, and Henry Knox. Had you guys ever even heard of Henry Knox before? Some of you have. But you've definitely heard of these 2 guys because they are strong-willed and strong-opinioned. And they're constant. One is in Washington's ear on one issue, and the other is in his ear on another. And together, they like nearly come to blows several times right in front of George Washington, arguing over what he should do. Now imagine you're George Washington, and you have these 2 brilliant men with fantastic ideas, and you have to make a decision. You have to agree with one of them, because you can't do both. Okay? So, not an easy job George Washington has. It's not an easy job. Okay? All right, so
Didn't he dig Hamilton's ideas most of the time?
he did. He does dig Hamilton's ideas mostly. Okay? And one of the ideas that Hamilton had, well, he has several, but one of his biggest one is about how to handle our finances. Because our finances are in the toilet, if there was a toilet then. The latrine. Okay. Alexander Hamilton loves Britain. He's an Anglophile, pro-British guy. He's from the British West Indies. That's kind of what he loved his adopted country. And doubts about his character and his loyalty were always rampant, but Hamilton kind of regarded himself as a prime minister in Washington's cabinet, even though there's no such thing. He just saw himself as more powerful than he actually was. And he always was thrusting himself into the affairs of the other departments, including his arch-rival Thomas Jefferson. But Hamilton, his major strength was that of finance. Financial wizard. And he set out immediately to try to correct the economic problems that had crippled America under the Articles of Confederation. And he was going to shape financial policy, or fiscal. Fiscal means kind of like financial, like a plan. And he's going to shape these policies in a way that favor wealthier people. He's going to favor wealthy groups of people. Now, it's not that he hates poor people. He has a plan, okay? He's going to believe that, because America in 1791, when he's doing this, guys, this is not the America of today. This is like, we're barely making it, okay? He believes that by helping out the wealthier groups of people, that those wealthy people, that, by very definition, wealthy people have money. And if he can get the wealthier groups on his side, that they would lend the government money. They could borrow money from wealthy Americans. How does what could they do? What could the government do to borrow money from wealthy Americans? How do you go about doing that? That's not borrowing, that's just taking. Borrowing is like, hey, can I borrow $10 and then tomorrow I give you $12? That's what borrowing is. They're going to take a loan out, basically sell like bonds. And wealthy Americans purchase these bonds. Now, let's say if you buy, did you guys ever get savings bonds as kids? Or they may have been gone forever now. All right, when I was a kid, in 1982, when I was born, my grandpa bought me a $50 savings bond. He paid $25 for it. But after about 25 or 30 years, I could go and I could get $50 for it, even though he only paid $25 for it. That is a way in which the government borrows money from people. That's how it works. Okay? Now, they don't exist anymore. It's kind of sad, no more savings bonds. But that's kind of what Alexander Hamilton did. Wealthy people would buy these bonds and buy things from the government. Now, that being said, if you're a wealthy person, are you going to buy $10 worth? You might buy $100,000 worth, or a vast amount, a big investment. What happens if the United States of America just comes crumbling down? What happens to your investment? It's gone. It disappears. So are you, as a wealthy citizen, are you invested in seeing America be successful? Yeah. And that's what Hamilton does. He gets the wealthiest people in America on his side, and by getting their investment, it serves two purposes. First, the government's getting money, much needed money. And second, he's getting support, because these wealthy people want to see America be successful. They want to see the government make it. Because if they don't make it, their money's gone. Now, that being said, after a few years, these people want their money. They want to get a return on their investment, because that's what it is. But that was Hamilton's plan, and it works. It works fantastically, okay?
Did he always speak for, his people?
He almost always sided with wealthier groups. It's kind of like what Sophie had mentioned earlier about how Hamilton was of the belief that America should almost be like an aristocracy ruled by the wealthy elites. And that was a federalist position. Whereas Thomas Jefferson, hey, everybody should have a say. Well, not everybody, but white landowning males should have a say, okay, regardless of your wealth. All right? So, questions on that? All right, that's a good place to stop, because things start to get interesting between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton.